Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I am very excited to be here with you to tell the story of Raspberry Robin with the help of Batman and Robin. So the theme, I'm going to just explain this a little bit. When I first debuted this talk for our threat detection series live, we were in a venue that had a Batman theme to it. So Susanna from our creative team, who's wonderful, suggested maybe Batman, and I was very excited. So it's definitely Batman. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with Holy Propagation Batman, tracking Raspberry Robin. A little bit more about me. I am an intelligence analyst on the Red Canary Intel team, and I've been here for about a year and a half or so. Before that, I was at Mandiant for 2 years, working in digital forensics and incident response. And before that, before I even got into cybersecurity, I got my MS in clinical psychology. So if you've seen me do some other talks, you know I love nerding out about psychology, but we're going to nerd out about different stuff today, including my favorite Batman. I was really going back and forth between Batman, the animated series, and classic Adam West. And in case you can't tell, classic Adam West won out. So that's who's going to be helping us tell the story today. And we're going to break it into 3 parts with today's Bat agenda. So part 1, I'll talk about how Raspberry Robin, the cluster, sort of got started at Red Canary. Part 2 will be mid-2022 in this narrative, kind of around when we published our blog post and afterwards. And then part 3, we'll talk a little bit about the end of the year of 2022, and then as we come into 2023, sort of where we are now with this threat. All right, so let's go back to a different bat time and a different bat channel to early 2022. These are actual transcripts from our team chat, and I thought they were great because it kind of tells the story of the beginnings of looking at this cluster. So there were these conversations going back and forth about detections that were a worm, maybe not a worm. Lauren, talking about this could be a USB worm. Tony actually hit on very early that this was connected to QNAP NAS devices. But before we get to that, before we get to the worm, not a worm, let's go back up to what Jeff says, which is, has anyone started a clustering spreadsheet? And at the time, we were doing a lot of our threat clustering in spreadsheets. Now we're using a different tool. We're using Synapse, which has been wonderful. Spreadsheets are still great, however you can organize the information. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our clustering methodology here at Red Canary. Everybody has a different way of naming threats, and threat naming is a whole separate topic. I could do a whole talk just on threat names and what those mean and how people come up with them. The first piece in these pieces that we at Red Canary need to have before we create a cluster. First of all, there needs to be no known community name. So the whole point of naming a threat is that you will be able to quickly communicate the behavior that is kind of under the umbrella of that name efficiently. So when you say, oh, this threat is Qbot, you will know, okay, Qbot, it's these behaviors. It helps make communication more efficient. And if there's already a community name, if people have already described some of the behavior and it's being used, it would be really inefficient to give it a new name. So we will use the community name if we see majority of overlap in activity. If there's kind of some overlap and some not, we may cluster it a little bit differently. If there is no known community name, then we'll start really considering that as a piece of, hey, do we want to create our own cluster? The second piece is that we need to see unique commonalities across multiple examples and multiple incidents. I don't want to say ideally in multiple environments because that's not ideal, but multiple environments and multiple incidents means there's a pattern, means there is behavior that we can categorize and we can track. A one-off, that's not a pattern. That's really difficult to keep track of. So we need to have those pieces of a pattern starting to come together. And there need to be distinct criteria with that pattern. So we need to be able to say, oh, this activity, this behavior, this process is unique to this potential cluster. And if we can't do that, if we can't really clearly delineate, this is different, then, maybe it falls into another cluster. Maybe it's not trackable yet. So once we have those three pieces, we have no known community name, we have these unique commonalities, patterns that we can track, and we have distinct criteria that we can say, this fits into this box. Then, boom, kapow, wham, we add a color and a bird because we are red canary, and we have an activity cluster. And so that's what happened when we started putting together the Raspberry Robin cluster. So what did that look like? What did that mean? So we started off with these really interesting, very brief, very wormy looking command line prompts or command lines. So you can see there's a little bit of mixed case, which is a theme that will continue. Mixed case is used by adversaries as kind of potential low-hanging fruit for evading some case-dependent, string-dependent AV and detection analytics. CMD.exe does not care about case, neither does PowerShell. That's why mixed case is used so often. And we see that file is being read in with that R flag. And it's a really little itty bitty file name, this tr.bin. It's strange. And so we saw that also in another environment. Very similar, not the same, different file name, slightly different way the command is structured, but again, very similar and very wormy looking, which is why the worm conversation started. After the initial command for cmd.exe, we'd see a Windows installer command if the activity continued. And this Windows installer command, this MSI exec command, is extremely interesting. This is really where we started to put the cluster together. So you've got it running quietly in the background. That's that Q flag. You see more mixed case. You've got the command reaching out to an external resource, a very short non-top level domain. So really weird domain over port 8080. And then you've got a random string, and the command would include the host name and the username for the victim system. Interesting, very, very unique and distinctive. And these little short domains are very strange. And we started seeing them, several different ones in different places with different commands, with different versions of this. And this is what I mean by creating a pattern. We see these multiple incidents when we start being able to kind of check these boxes. Another thing I want to note, that random string, really interesting. The team over at Sequoia.io figured out that that is probably a token. And so I thought that was just a neat thing I wanted to throw in there. And so as we started making all these connections and putting it together, we had our cluster. We had our Raspberry Robin activity. And this is how we categorized it at that point. So this is early 2022. So to be Raspberry Robin, the activity had to have an external USB device. The device names would very often also have mixed case when it was creating their registry entries. And the commands, again, this mixed case theme continued. You'd see first cmd.exe reading in a file. You'd see Windows installer reaching out to a remote resource, using a short, usually recently registered domain with a few characters. And as you saw earlier, Tony mentioned, those domains, all of them, all those IP addresses associated with the domains had recently hosted QNAP NAS devices. And so that was also a really interesting note. I wanted to say something about the external USB drive. We talked to a lot of people about the initial execution of the device. So how did it need user interactivity, because that's part of the definition of a worm. And we spoke to several people after the blog post came out that said they had auto run turned off in their environment, which is not a bad idea, and that it executed anyway without user interaction. So that is something that is one of our questions we still kind of have about the activity. But that's another piece of that kind of execution chain. And as it continued, we've talked about several of these steps already, the MSI exec command would pull down a DLL, a very suspicious DLL, that at the time didn't do anything or didn't do anything obviously malicious. It didn't seem to install anything. Very strange, very unusual. But it would execute using run DLL32 and would get launched usually with a different utility like odbcconf. The reason adversaries used that is because it automatically executes with elevated privileges, and so it kind of removes a step. If you can go ahead and get your DLL to execute using utility that's got elevated privileges, you don't have to do an additional privilege escalation step. And then we'd see, again, if the activity was allowed to continue, if the system wasn't contained, or if we just it continued on, we'd see ongoing C2 activity. So we'd see reg server 32, run DLL 32, and DLL host reaching out to IP addresses. And and this is just in general good kind of detection opportunity, if you see these executables reaching out to remote resources with no command line, that is very suspicious. And so we were seeing a lot of that, usually reaching out to Tor nodes. And so this is sort of the picture of Raspberry Robin that we had in early 2022. I'm paraphrasing Batman a little bit in this slide. Batman actually said good grammar is essential, but good intel is also essential. So here we are. We have this cluster, and we know a lot from what we've seen, but we are still missing some pieces. We don't know the initial infection vector for the USBs. We don't know what the DLL is doing or what the end goal is. We were really curious about whether other people were seeing this activity as well. So we decided, even with our intelligence gaps, that we would go ahead and write a blog and share what we knew. Because this is one of the things I love about being here on this team at Red Canary, everybody has intelligence gaps. Nobody has perfect understanding of these threats, especially early on. And if we can start a conversation and hear from others, we can pool our kind of collective security community resources, which is really awesome. And so that's what we decided to do. That brings us to part 2, Raspberry Robin. Raspberry Robin's going to grow up and leave the nest. We published our blog in May of 2022, which I helped write along with Lauren Podber, who is now at Microsoft. She's an awesome analyst. And we hoped that we would get some feedback. We hoped we'd hear from other folks that may have seen this activity. Yeah, we heard from a lot of folks. Community response was awesome and massive. So we heard back from a ton of people, not just on Twitter. Folks emailed us, we got DMs from people talking about this activity, people detailing stuff that we had seen and sharing new information. It was incredible. And so really quickly, in the first few days after the blog post, we learned a lot more about Raspberry Robin. So we learned that it was not just us. Raspberry Robin was widespread, globally widespread. And it had been seen in multiple continents and all kinds of industries. This one we did not know until folks told us, and we had multiple independent individuals from different enterprises sharing this with us, was that the USB devices were personal devices that had recently been used at print shops and mail shops. So, somebody takes their USB device to go get some photos printed out or make some copies, that device would have Raspberry Robin on it when it came back to the enterprise and got plugged in. So that was really fascinating. We never would have guessed that that had been a common infection vector, but it was. A ton of other teams had seen it, like I said, and it was really neat. Right after our blog came out, other teams published their findings as well. So Sequoia.io published their findings about what they were calling the QNAP worm. And I think Avast put out a really good article soon after. Lots of folks, which was fantastic. So immediately there was a ton of information sharing, and we gained a lot more visibility into the threat. But no one had seen it do anything other than the C2 communications, which is just so strange. And I got real tinfoil hat about it that summer. You know, I was hoping we'd hear some feedback, but we didn't hear anything back. We're kind of waiting. We were waiting for the other shoe to drop, because it's weird. All this great tradecraft, and then nothing happens. It's super strange. The shoe dropped, however, in July of 2022. So Microsoft published, they have an ongoing blog that's really wonderful and interesting. If you haven't read it, you can go take a look at their kind of ongoing understanding of ransomware as a service. And they included Raspberry Robin in this blog, saying that they had seen it deliver SOC goalish, which is also known as fake updates. That is really interesting because, you know, SOC goalish and fake updates, that's a well-established malware family. So this has gone from a curiosity to now a delivery vehicle for a very well-known threat that is pre-ransomware behavior. So Microsoft reported that the follow-on activity was similar to what they track as Manatee Tempest. And Manatee Tempest falls under the umbrella of groups that they track as part of Evil Corp. Evil Corp is allegedly a Russian-based threat group that has been involved in a number of different high-profile threats and high-profile threat activity. They're involved in the Dridex malware distribution, and more recently, they have also been involved in, implicated in the CLOP and MoveIt vulnerabilities that have been in the news since this June. So really, all of a sudden, this has changed drastically. No longer just a curious worm. Now we're into like well-established threat, higher risk territory. And I'm really glad, again, this information sharing was wonderful, because we saw this happen after the blog was published, or their article was updated. We saw Raspberry Robin drop SOC goalish in a customer environment. And, you know, we had great Raspberry Robin detections already, but we were kind of prepared for that, which was great, which was really helpful. It was extremely fast. So in this particular example, I think it was 8 minutes from the USB being plugged in to SOC goalish download. So pretty rapid. Again, really helpful. Some huge changes in July to our understanding of this threat. And then a little later in the year, getting into the fall, in September, we had another couple of great community articles come out. IBM published an article on the DLL and reported that they saw a lot of code similarities to Dridex malware. Those of you who work in development and reverse engineering, you know, it's writing code is like writing anything else. There are similarities across time by similar authors and similar developers. So they saw a number of overlaps between the Raspberry Robin DLL and Dridex malware, which again makes sense and kind of confirms or reaffirms that connection back to Evil Corp. And the other article that came out is fascinating. All of them are, but Avast managed to reverse engineer the DLL, and they decided to call it Roshtiak, which is a string that's in the DLL. This is incredible. So the DLL has up to 14 different layers of highly obfuscated code. And the anti-aliasing and anti-analysis checks in it are extremely robust. This is a very complicated piece of malware. It's so robust that on level 9, so we've gone down 9 levels of anti-aliasing and obfuscation. If all of its checks aren't met, it will unpack and deliver a fake payload. It will unpack and deliver a, I think it's a browser adware payload. So very kind of just like, you know, unwanted, but not this level of malicious kind of deliverable or delivery of this payload. Just crazy fake payloads. Anyway, once they got it reverse engineered, you know, they had evidence of it doing the things that we had already seen it doing behaviorally. So yes, it could, you know, create the C2 activity. It could create tasks for persistence. It could download and execute additional payloads. Just a ton of capabilities. Then, a little more into the fall, our understanding of Raspberry Robin continued to develop. Microsoft published another article about Raspberry Robin specifically and its role in the pre-ransomware ecosystem. So at this point, and they've actually continued to update this article. So if you read this article last year, it has changed since then, and they continue to share more follow-on malware families that they've seen. So at this point, Raspberry Robin has delivered a lot of pre-ransomware malware families, including Cobalt Strike, Ice ID, and TrueBot, which y'all may recognize as being in the news a lot lately because it was pre-ransomware activity for some of the Clop ransomware that has been in the news lately. And the other neat thing that they shared in this article was they saw a new type of malware specifically designed to be delivered with Raspberry Robin. So it was similar to fake updates, which is why they called it FAUPod. You know, it's fake updates. But it's a really interesting piece of malware all on its own. And the additional post-compromise activity that they saw as part of this kind of larger pre-ransomware ecosystem was they attributed some of the activity to Lace Tempest that overlaps with TA505 activity, not 5055, but TA505. And that's also got connections to Evil Corp as well. So huge changes. We've gone from the beginning of the year to what is this thing? Is it a worm? We don't know what this is, to this is part of an extremely well-connected and elaborate ransomware ecosystem. Huge changes, really, really interesting. And that brings us to where we're at now. So when I said where we're at now, you know, this was part of our threat detection series, and our threat detection report comes out at the beginning of, it came out at the beginning of 2023. And so we will talk more about Raspberry Robin's story over this year in our next threat detection report, but I can give y'all a little bit of information. So at the end of 2022, this is sort of how the activity looked over time for us. It was the 7th most commonly associated threat across all of our customer environments in 2022. And the activity increased as the year went on, which is really interesting. You can see on the timeline here, you know, we included some of the publications that I talked about. And it's interesting, the spike after the initial SOC Goalish article came out in July, really fascinating. Not sure if that's due to more awareness and better detection analytics on the part of, you know, the folks that are detecting it, which is really, really interesting. I can say for this year, as we sit here today, it's currently at number 9 for the year. This may change. We have our monthly intelligence insights that come out. So on the Intel team, we put out kind of a monthly wrap up at the beginning of the month for our customers, and it has a lot of kind of updated threat information. We have our top 10, we have more context around the numbers we see. And we also do a public version. Our public version will actually come out tomorrow for this past month. And I can say that, I'll go ahead and give you all a preview. The top 10 for June did not include Raspberry Robin. Raspberry Robin activity was reduced a good bit last month, even though it started off the beginning of the year in like spot number 2, spot number 5. You can see last year it had a similar pattern. So is this like the QBot affiliates? Do they follow some kind of distribution pattern? It'll be interesting to see. Only time will tell how it will change over the rest of this year. But if you're curious about what we're seeing, we do share that every month in our public intelligence insights. So you can keep up with whether or not we've seen more Raspberry Robin activity later in the year. And then, of course, when our TDR comes out, we'll share everything kind of in summary. So what do you do? What do you do if you see Raspberry Robin in your environment? So if you detect Raspberry Robin, so you've got the cmd.exe execution, maybe you've even got that Windows installer command, block malicious network connections, block that domain, block the IP address if you have it. Make sure to remove any malicious files from the system. Make sure that initial .link file that kicks off the cmd.exe command is removed. And also make sure that you identify the USB device source and clean that up as well, because we have seen environments where the same USB got plugged into multiple endpoints, and we know it was the same one because the script, the outgoing command, is always the same except for the host name and the username. So make sure you do your due diligence and get that cleaned up as well. And then if you do have follow-on activity, or if it gets to that Windows installer command, if you see any evidence that that DLL may have been downloaded, go ahead and isolate the device. If you're able to go ahead and isolate the device and you want to, even before you see evidence of potential DLL download, that's not a bad idea. This is pre-ransomware malware at this point, and it's continued to move extremely fast. It actually is much faster than 8 minutes from USB plugin to malicious activity now in some cases. So if you want to do that, and go ahead and, reimage your device, whatever you think is best for your enterprise and your risk model. But really, it's all about rapid detection and early response to keep it from continuing. I want to offer another detection opportunity. I know I mentioned those outbound network communications with no command lines. This is another good one. This one will need a little bit more tuning, but looking at Windows installer downloading and executing packages from remote resources, this is something that's used by threats other than Raspberry Robin. This is also used by QBot sometimes, for example. So if you see Windows installer reaching out, especially with the quiet flag, that's a sign that it's maybe a little bit more suspicious. It's worth taking a look at. Now, this may be very common in your environment, but if it is, this might not be as useful for you. However, if you do find it useful, definitely something just to consider if this is a good fit for something to monitor in your environment. As we come to the end of our content, what are our takeaways after all of this, after this journey that we've been on? First of all, Raspberry Robin is a widespread threat, and it continues to be a widespread threat, even though we've seen reduced volume. That does not mean that volume is reduced everywhere. It's still very much in use by adversaries. And because of that, the risk assessment has changed over time, going from, like I said, this curiosity to delivering multiple pieces of pre-ransomware malware. It's much higher risk now. So that's one of the things that we kind of learned as we took this journey. We still have intelligence gaps. I still have a bunch of questions. The biggest one, and this, I don't know if I will ever get the answer, but I would love to know how the print shops have Raspberry Robin introduced to their environment. Like, how does it get there? Because we haven't seen evidence of Raspberry Robin propagating on endpoints. That's one of the ways that it is not as worm-like. Worms do self-propagate. We haven't seen Raspberry Robin do that. So how does it get to the print shops? I don't know. I would love to know. That's one of the things that I hope someday in the fullness of time we'll get more information about. And the last takeaway, and this is the one that I think I feel the most strongly about, is that sharing knowledge is just a wonderful thing to do. It makes all of us and all of our customers better and safer. You know, I love that at Red Canary, we can share information. Even if we don't have the full picture, we can make the picture more full by exchanging information. And security community and researchers really come together to do as much information sharing as they can. It's awesome. And it was really awesome to see that happen as part of our Raspberry Robin story. I want to give special thanks to a couple of people. Of course, we have the current Red Canary intelligence team and Jason Killam, who is an all-around awesome detection engineer and threat hunter and researcher. He's actually the one who wrote the original detection logic to help us detect the Raspberry Robin activity from the very beginning. And then also Aaron, Lauren, and Harrison were deeply involved with the initial cluster creation for Raspberry Robin. So I want to give a big shout out to them. We definitely would not have the complete and full picture of it that we had then and that we have now without their help. And that, my friends, is all the content I have for you today. I'm pretty easy to find on Twitter. So if you have additional questions that we don't get to after, because we have a little bit of time left, and I'm going to see what's in the Q&A. I haven't been watching it while I've been chatting. If you have additional questions or comments, feel free to reach out to me. I love getting to talk about this. I love getting to talk about the work that the Intel team does here at Red Canary. It's just good, nerdy fun. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the questions. So if you have questions that you haven't asked yet, feel free to go ahead and throw those in the Q&A, and I will go through them until Adam says we don't have any more time left. So, okay. First of all, I see a question from Jacob. Where did Red Canary see Raspberry Robin land the most frequently? So I'm guessing that this is like, where did we see it? I don't think you mean like where did it download to, because that would depend on kind of what the user's settings were on their endpoint. It really was not confined to a specific industry. I don't think we ever saw it on anything other than Windows systems. So this does seem to be Windows-specific malware, as far as I know. So yeah, it was really interesting that it did not seem to have any clear specific targeted industry, which makes sense. You know, if it's getting kind of, if USBs are catching it at these print shops, you can't really control that. And then if it's the folks that distribute SOT-Golish is also very strategic. They triage their victims and decide who to pursue for additional malicious activity. I'm sure the Raspberry Robin folks, they seem to do the same. All right, so Vivek, yes, I think that the webinar is being recorded. I'm not sure when or where it will be shared, but you know, we can definitely make sure that that information is shared, and if it is shared, we'll let you know. If the USB got infected, this is Raul's question, with Raspberry Robin at the local print shop, how was the print shop compromised? See, this was earlier in the talk. Raul, you have the same question I do. I don't know. When I've given this talk before, we've had some good guesses. My favorite suggestion so far, and this is really interesting, is that there may be some way that these devices, so like maybe different printers or USB drives, is there a way that maybe they're connected to the internet? You know, these folks like to exploit vulnerable infrastructure based on their use of the QNAP NAS devices. We don't know. So that's one question. I know a couple of people here on the team, like Brian Donahue, wants to just go plug USB drives into print shops and see if we can find it in the wild. So if you do that, please write a blog about it and please share more details. For Michio, I see, could it be over detection? And I think this is talking about kind of the changes over time, potentially, and it could be. You know, there's a lot of factors that go into the frequency at which specific threats are detected and associated. So that's kind of beyond me being able to answer with any hardcore certainty. All right. Adam, is this one specific print shop? Many are franchised and use similar systems. Aha! Compromised commercial printers. Okay, so that's, again, hitting on what somebody else also thought, Adam. So there's a lot of hypotheses going around. As far as I know, it is not one specific print shop. I did not notice any specific name or franchise or trend in the print shops. A lot of them are also international, so this is not just US specific. We also heard of print shops in Germany and India and a lot of places being impacted. So really, really interesting hypotheses. All right, are there any other questions? If anybody has them, please ponder and go ahead and throw in the Q&A. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Got to see a lot of, I was recently doing some research on TrueBot, and it was really at the end of December that Raspberry Robin started being a really common TrueBot distribution vector. So I'm guessing, you know, this is really prolific. At one point, Microsoft said that it had been in hundreds of enterprises and thousands of endpoints. That doesn't mean it's still there, but at some point it had touched a whole lot of systems. So there's really only time will tell how it may change in the future. Let's see. Raul asks, it's a common to see payloads delivered via SNMP injections. This is not that specific delivery methodology is not one of my areas of expertise. I know that it is something that does happen, but I couldn't tell you kind of how common it was or the number of threats that do that really, really prominently. So if I do have more answers to that, I'll throw them up on Twitter and let you know more if I find more about that. Can this be, Michael says, can this be mitigated by disabling read-write on USBs? This can be, we think, it helps. So turning off auto run is never a bad idea. Reviewing your USB policies is never a bad idea. I do think that as much as you can, limiting the ease of use of USBs in your enterprise environments is never a bad idea. So yeah, turning off auto run and it could definitely help mitigating those read-write on USBs. A lot of people I know don't think of USBs as being a really common threat vector anymore. They definitely are. Mandiant actually just put out another really good blog talking about USBs as infection vectors. And we've seen some old Gamaru/Andromeda infections as well. We being the security community being leveraged. So don't sleep on USBs. They're still out there. What happens when, this is Devlin asked, what happens when two separate research teams name a threat? Which name is used for public disclosure? Oh gosh, that again could be a whole talk all on its own. What happens very often is a team will publish their findings with the name that they're using internally. So for example, like from this talk, we started this Raspberry Robin cluster. That activity also fell under, according to Microsoft, Manatee Tempest and Lace Tempest activity, which, according to Proofpoint, falls under the TA505 umbrella. And so what we tend to do, and the way we tend to look at it, is if the activity has significant overlap, then it's kind of whoever publishes first and gets the most traction. If somebody publishes a big blog and the name catches on, that's the name that'll stick. Sometimes they're just used simultaneously. Like I mentioned, Microsoft, CrowdStrike, Proofpoint have names that have a lot of overlap. And we just do the best we can to make sure we're communicating what behavior that describes as clearly as we can. But it is very complex and very complicated. All right, so Tier asked, can I please specify any of the DLLs after the execution? So the Raspberry Robin DLL, the names were usually random characters. So it wasn't like a specific USB name. And I can actually, let me come over here. I can pull this up and take a look at it and see if I can give you any additional details about DLL names. So they're random characters for the most part, which is not helpful. But as you know from other threats like Qbot, randomized character names are really, really popular because they're harder to detect and write detection logic for. There are examples of the DLL that have been uploaded. Sometimes it's the fake payload on VirusTotal that's been associated. But if you're more curious about the DLL, I highly recommend you check out Avast's article, which is included in the slides. And I think that the PDF will go out, so you'll be able to take a look if you're more curious. All right. Thank you all so much for attending today and for all the really wonderful questions. We really appreciate it. And I think that's all that I have for y'all. Adam, do you have any final thoughts, any other notes for everyone?
No, terrific job. Just a reminder, we've put some resources on your console for you, so please feel free to download any of those. We did include the slide deck today as well, so you'll find that there. And then as you exit, there will be a short survey. We value your feedback. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day.